So Osama bin Laden's strategy, what was his strategy in the 9/11 attacks? What was his strategy in Afghanistan and Pakistan? What was his strategy with Al Qaeda and suicide terrorism? And this will take multiple videos to explain because there's so much history here going back upwards of 50 years in the Middle East and with Osama bin Laden. A great series of videos to watch on Osama bin Laden is called The Power of Nightmares. It's a documentary series you can look up on YouTube. But I wanted to look at Osama bin Laden's overall strategy and then kind of what led him to it and how this strategy was more or less effective in accomplishing what he sought to be his goal. Now, obviously, he didn't really get to his goal, which was establishment of an Islamic caliphate, but his strategy was effective in achieving some of the things that he saw as being necessary, as being on the way to those things. So, part of his strategy is messaging. The religious leaders who were radicalized, who came before and even during bin Laden, believed that Muslims in their lands and in the Holy Land and all over the world were being corrupted, and that if they were brought forcefully back to the idea of true Islam, then they would overthrow these westernized and governments and these dictatorships that are supported by Western governments in the Middle East, and that all they had to do at first was to preach against the culture and the immorality and the Western capitalism and these type of things, which they did, but they eventually realized that that wasn't working. And so they decided to aim at something that was more effective. They changed their messaging. And whatever we say about Osama bin Laden, a very evil man, he was a brilliant strategist and did think very carefully about the plan and execution of his ideas. But his messaging included targeting, number one, tangible political grievances rather than abstract principles. And we're going to look at what some of those were. But we've already seen in previous videos the foreign occupation of an area and the struggle for that area's national identity is the greatest predictor of suicide terrorism. Also, the the violence and the interventions from the United States government and its allies in the Middle East over the past decades, especially from 1990 moving forward, was tangible in the minds of the people living in that region and around the world who were sympathetic to this messaging. Tangible political grievances where he said, we're not just going to call out Western capitalism and Western culture and its immorality. He said, we want to remove the American presence from Saudi Arabia, which was more powerful to people because there was a clear definitional way of seeing whether that objective had been met or not met. And so the messaging changed, and this made Osama bin Laden's strategy more potent. His second part of his strategy was to provoke, and we'll talk about this in a separate video, more on this later. But the idea it was he was not surprised, nor was he dismayed when the United States decided to go to war in Afghanistan. His plan was to draw the United States into war in Afghanistan. His plan was to draw them into an endless war and to bankrupt them, eventually leading to an economic collapse. And show why historically he thought that this would work. And to his credit, The Afghanistan war has been the longest war in American history and has cost upwards of $5.6 trillion by today's date and has cost U.S. taxpayers and government either by taxes directly or inflation or just debt and what's called military spending. It has cost more than the entire Marshall Plan that was used to rebuild Western Europe after World War II. So his goal was to provoke the United States in to destabilize the region and to overthrow these dictators and things for them so that they could establish an Islamic state or a caliphate, not the Islamic State proper, but an Islamic state. And the United States has largely fulfilled bin Laden's objectives. It hasn't fallen into an economic collapse. However, it has fought in this war and it has drained much of the U.S. Treasury through either taxation, debt, or inflation for war spending. And so this is what Osama bin Laden wanted. Most people don't realize that that's what he wanted, but his goal was to provoke an overreaction from the United States, not to make a hit and run away. And so Osama bin Laden wanted the United States in a war with Afghanistan, and where he got this idea was from his experiences in the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. During the Cold War, the United States had its Vietnam, and the Russians had their Afghanistan. Russia sought to invade Afghanistan, and Osama bin Laden helped in Afghanistan at this time fight against the Soviet invasion, and then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990 and 1991 and was dissolved. And so he saw that as using Afghanistan as this quagmire to bring down one of the most powerful military empires in history. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed for many reasons, but the Afghanistan War was one of them. And there is an academic paper on this from the International Journal of Russian Studies called The Quicksand of Afghanistan, the impact of the Afghanistan War on the breakup of the Soviet Union, which does speak to this. And it's in the footnotes here. But whether or not Osama bin Laden's assessment of why the Soviet Union collapsed is correct, this is what he saw as possible to do to a great empire, was to drag it into this war and bring it into a long war that eventually leads to economic collapse. And so after that happened to the Soviet Union, he saw this as a viable option for provoking the United States. Let's talk about the Soviet-Afghan War and the Carter Doctrine from then President Jimmy Carter. So President Jimmy Carter first authorized in 1979 the covert CIA aid to the Afghan Mujahideen in order to provoke Soviet invasion there. This was on July 3rd, 1979. So you can see the U.S. is intervening in Afghanistan as well. They're not going into a war there, like with Vietnam, to prevent communism. They're doing more covert actions through the CIA. But they're arming people who eventually would be seen as their enemies, the Afghan Mujahideen, in order to provoke Soviet invasion. Later, Carter used that Soviet invasion as a justification for the need for further U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. So the cycle starts of causing something, getting a result, and then after causing that, using that problem created by the result as further justification for intervening. The U.S. and the U.S. CIA, bin Laden, and the Afghan Mujahideen worked together against the Soviets at this time. Many people probably don't know that, But the United States and Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Mujahideen worked together against the Soviets during this time and against the secular government of Afghanistan. So, why is Osama bin Laden our enemy? Well, that story unfolds a bit more. So, in 1986, Afghanistan's largely unheard of by most Americans. It's not like they don't, wouldn't know the name if you had never, if you said it to them, but it's not in the news. It's not a topic of discussion. It's not something that's seen as a major key player in the world. Abdullah Azzam, a mentor to Osama bin Laden, told the author of this book, War at the Top of the World, Eric S. Margolis, he told him in 1986, as he was a journalist interviewing uh, in his line of work, he said, when we have driven out the communist imperialists from Afghanistan, we will go on and drive the American imperialists from Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world. So, and then Margolis describes himself as being shocked. He said, we were helping them drive out the Soviets, the communists, but he had never heard America referred to as an imperialist empire. And then you hear in Azam's quotation there to Margolis the same idea that was present in the suicide terrorism video. It wasn't just a blind hatred of the West, but an occupation of Arabia and the Muslim world. And the idea was to get that foreign military occupation out. And so the plan of Azzam, who was a mentor to Osama bin Laden and Osama bin Laden himself and others, was to side with the Americans long enough to drive out the Soviets and then use that same strategy to later drive out the Americans, not only from Afghanistan, but from Arabia and the whole Muslim world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Osama bin Laden believed Afghanistan had brought down one of the most powerful empires in history. And there is something to that. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a disaster towards the end of the Soviet Union that did lead to its collapse. During the Afghanistan overthrow, though, this is what the United States participated in. The U.S. was indispensable in the overthrow of the secular government of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Now, Afghanistan would be a relatively progressive place to live by Western, not a great place to live by Western standards, but by the standards of the surrounding region and other lands influenced by Islam, it's relatively secular. It's a relatively better place to live. It's relatively liberalized during this time in the 1980s. But the U.S. helped overthrow that secular government of the 1980s. And so, as people talk about uh, the mistreatment of women in these regions as a justification for intervention, well, the overthrow of this secular government allowed for and led to the power of an Islamic fundamentalist regime that was very bad for women, especially contrasting what they had had before. This was a lot worse situation for women, and this was brought about by the United States intervention there. The reason was because the Afghanistan government at the time was allied with the Soviet Union, so the U.S. helped with Osama bin Laden, with the Mujahideen, to overthrow it and then fight the Russians as they invaded Afghanistan. This led to the power of an Islamic fundamentalist regime, and eventually, in the 1990s, the Taliban, the government that gave refuge to Osama bin Laden for a time until he moved to Pakistan. Now, the goal during this time, the Cold War, toward the end of the Cold War, was to draw the Russians into a quagmire, which they did. However, there were lasting consequences that were unintended for the overthrow of the Afghanistan secular government in the 1980s. Here's some of the consequences for women. 1986 study of the U.S. Army reported the following policies toward women before the government was overthrown. So they had government policies in place like this, and then they did not have them after the U.S. helped overthrow that secular government. So in 1986, the Afghanistan had policies for women such as freedom of choice in marriage partner, and that's for everyone, not just women. Minimum legal age to marry at 16. For men, they had to be 18. Women could be 16, get married, but could not be legally any younger. They abolished forced marriages. They had literacy programs and girls and boys in the same classrooms. But after the overthrow, women were subjected to the harshness of an Islamic fundamentalist regime, which would later be an ally, at least in part, to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist attacks, namely 9/11. So why did Osama bin Laden and others in the region, when the U.S. was helping them in a war for freedom against the USSR, why weren't they more grateful? Why did they want to drive out the U.S.? Well, it was part of the Carter Doctrine during the 1970s, 76 to 79 80, of permanent U.S. supremacy in the Persian Gulf in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This had spread military presence through the Arabian Peninsula, reading to the people who lived there foreign occupation. Following that, a Republican president, different administration, Ronald Reagan, expanded the buildup of U.S. military bases in Saudi Arabia, understood by the people who live there as foreign military occupation that threatens their national identity and self-determination. Then, 1990-1991, 70 more permanent military bases were added in Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, in addition to the bases that were already in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain to prepare for the Iraq War I. And so this is again understood by the people as foreign occupation by an outside power that does not share their culture, that does not share their religion, that does not share their values, that does not speak their language, but are armed and in their land, controlling them politically and economically. And that's not to speak of the individual troops necessarily, but you have to think of how we would be viewing these things were they being done to us. The rapidly increasing presence of U.S. bases in the Arabian Peninsula exacerbated this resentment. This resentment would be used as a powerful tool by Osama bin Laden as part of his messaging for a jihad against the United States. And if he didn't gain actual, I'll say, troops in his cause, he at least gained sympathy from the surrounding community because his goal was to drive the American presence, the American government military presence, from the Muslim lands and the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East, which people could get on board with, even if they couldn't get on board with his methods.